Welcome to the Local Government Induction Program presented by Local Government Managers Australia. LGMA is a not-for-profit, member-based organisation that exists to provide local government advocacy, collaborative learning and professional development services to council officers across Queensland. The purpose of this program is to provide you with an understanding of the functions, responsibilities and operating environment of local government in Queensland. If this is your first appointment to a role in the public service, or perhaps you've worked in the public sector before at the state or federal level, the aim of this program is to help you to better understand where you as a council officer fit within the scheme of things. To ensure that everyone will be on the same page by the end of the program, we're going to take it back to basics. So what exactly will we be covering in this program? Well, we've broken it up into 6 segments. First, we will start with an overview of the 3 levels of government in Australia, those being local, state and federal. Then we will move on to the regulatory context and talk about the Local Government Act and other legislation that impacts on and guides local government life. From there, we will shift our focus to the financials and discuss where the money comes from and what it means to manage and use public money. Next is the decision-making process, specifically how this works across 3 levels, from officer level through to management to elected officials. In the section about monitoring, we will cover the who, the what, the how and more. And then finally, we will finish up with a quick dip into the local government pond to introduce you to the organisations that exist to support you on your journey as a local government officer. So let's get started. So when you think about the word government, what are some of the words that immediately spring to mind? Perhaps words like politicians, parties, problems and promises? What about community, collaboration, consultation and care? And when you think about local government in particular, the old adage of the 3 R's might come to mind, the old roads, rates and rubbish. But nowadays, that seems somewhat inadequate when describing the breadth of services that local governments deliver on behalf of their communities. Phrases like community shaping, sustainable development, and transparency are now at the forefront of what we as community members, ratepayers, and taxpayers have come to expect and demand from every level of government. We often hear local government being described as the level of government that most closely aligns to the community and their aspirations. And this is a very fair description, given how accessible we are to our local community, both as officers and councillors. And by accessible, we mean in the literal sense, you can literally bump into a councillor or council employee at the local shops. And this is particularly true in small communities where everyone knows someone who works for council. They could even be related to someone working in council. The same cannot be said for the state and federal government levels. For people that are new to the public service, the local government environment can be confusing. There are a lot of abbreviations, acronyms, jargon, and some words that mean different things in the local government context compared with when it's used in a different industry. Add to that the state and federal government acronyms, policies, legislation, and agendas, and it starts to look even more complex and hard to navigate. Knowing which parts are important and which parts will help you do your job is the key. So let's start with what is really the most important part of the puzzle, you.
So, you applied for a job, you were successful, and now here you sit. Congratulations. You are now part of a team, which in turn is part of a unit, department, or division. The services delivered by local governments are many and varied, so it stands to reason that the teams within local governments are also many and varied. Perhaps you are part of the customer service team, the parks team, the records team, the planning team, the water and waste team, or the roads team. Whichever team you are part of in local government, you are part of something larger. No one works in isolation. Even the CEO has a team, the executive leadership team. And all together, we make up the council, an interconnected, interdependent organisation that exists to serve the community. The great state of Queensland is currently made up of 77 local government areas. They go by different names. Some are shires or Aboriginal shires, some are regional councils, and others are city councils. However, essentially, we all do the same thing in mostly the same way. Councils deliver services to our local area with a group of councillors elected by the voters of our local government area. Some councils are compact in land area and big on population, while others are huge in land area with less population per capita. Some have coastal areas, some are inland. Some have suburban and urban areas, whilst others are full of farms and wide open spaces. The common point is that we all deliver for our community, the set number of councillors and a mayor, and it takes over 560 councils to manage all the local government communities across Australia. The next level is made up of the state and territory governments. Each state is a little different in its configuration and how it goes about doing their role. It is the Queensland Government and its Local Government Act 2009 that outlines the way in which a local government is constituted, the nature and extent of its responsibilities and powers, and ensures the system of local government in Queensland is accountable, effective, efficient and sustainable. The federal government is our national parliament that meets in Canberra. The federal parliament has the power to make laws for the whole country as listed in the Australian Constitution on things like immigration, taxation, defence and foreign affairs. The federal government has two houses made up of elected representatives. One is called the lower house, the House of Representatives, and the other is called the upper house, the Senate. Australia belongs to the Commonwealth of Nations, which is a voluntary association of 54 independent and equal countries where member governments have agreed to share goals like development, democracy and peace. Whilst the Commonwealth's roots go back to the British Empire, any country can join the modern Commonwealth. The last country to join the Commonwealth was Rwanda in 2009. Australia is a constitutional monarchy, which means the power of the monarch or head of state are limited by law or convention and are generally exercised only according to the advice of an elected government. Australia's current head of state is King Charles III. In Australia, the powers of the King have been delegated by the Australian Constitution to his representative in Australia, the Governor-General. Think of the Governor-General as the King's representative in Australia.
In a moment, we'll play a short video that puts all of this into context and talks a little bit about service delivery. Now let's have a closer look at what is the same and what is different at each level of government. On this table we can see that all levels have elected representatives, but they are called different things. All have an election cycle, all make laws, all collect taxes, fees and charges, all have public servants doing the hard yards delivering on decisions of elected representatives. Leadership at the elected levels differs by way of title and methodology. In local government in Queensland, a council is led by an elected mayor, elected directly by the people in the local area. This is not always the case in other states. In the Queensland state government, it is led by the Premier, elected by a party with the majority of seats. Same at the federal level, except of course we call the leader the Prime Minister. So only at local government level do we have the leader elected directly by the people in that area. Now, the Mayor is joined by elected councillors to take responsibility for decision making regarding issues brought to council meetings. They are all elected for 4 years, we call this a term, and must all re-stand for election if they want to come back for another term. There are 5 or more councillors in each council depending on how many people live in the local government area. The state government members also have a 4-year term, while the federal government has 2 different terms, 6 years for the Senate and 3 years for the House of Representatives. Another point of difference is that local government is not recognised in the Constitution of Australia, but is referred to in the Queensland Constitution. As to the management of local government, the Mayor and councillors employ the CEO, and then the CEO employs all other staff who work for the council. That's important to understand because this is about separation of powers. In the state, the top managers are called Director Generals, while in the federal system they are called Secretary. The councillors make the decision, set policy positions, adopt strategies, and approve budgets. Then they usually delegate the whole lot to the CEO to make it happen. As I mentioned before, in local government there is no constitution, which means there is no governor, and mostly no formal political party alignment of councillors, and therefore no formal opposition. We do find formal opposition at the state and federal level, and party politics is the major alliance structure. Some councils, usually the larger city councils, do have party-aligned councillors. These like-minded councillors may form an opposition of sorts against councillors from a different political persuasion. Brisbane City Council is the exception here, with a formal opposition and processes to support a largely party-aligned structure. On the whole, local government is about making the best decisions for the community, based on community needs, wants and aspirations, not based on a political party agenda. I'd like you to imagine for a moment this scenario, and as I'm reading it out, have a think to yourself and perhaps even count how many times you have used or accessed a local government service or asset. You get up at 6 a.m, you go to the bathroom, grab a big glass of water, get dressed for your morning walk along the cycleway by the creek. It's a bit dark and you notice that the street lights are still on. Plus, whoops, it's really been day. You decide to take Spot the dog with you, and together you haul the red bin up the drive. On reaching the creek, you see that the local creek beautification group has been at it again. More trees planted, looks good. Feeling energetic, you come home via the exercise park to get in a few chin-ups. Spot poops, so being a good person, you pooper scoop that hottie up and dump it in the dog waste bin. Heading home, you grab a protein smoothie from the food van as you leave the park. Home again, you shower, clean your teeth, get dressed and head off to catch the bus into work. It's clouding over, so you seek cover in the bus shelter. Checking the real-time signage, you see the bus is on time. As your bus leaves, the storm rains down and you watch the gutters fill with water. It's only 8:30 a.m. How many touch points did you count? No doubt you got the dog park and the rubbish bin and maybe the bus and the bus shelter, but what about the water? And did you get the mobile vendor licensing and the community group funding? In this scenario, between 6 a.m. and 8:30, we counted 22 contacts with the local government provided service or asset. That's a lot of touch points for one person, a very small window of time, fewer than 3 hours. Let's explore what else we do as council officers and what services the other parts of government look after. Local government does a whole lot of stuff that is, on one hand, highly visible, highly accessible, and then on the other hand is almost taken for granted, sometimes even invisible, or at least it is invisible until something goes wrong. For example, you turn on the tap and you expect high quality, drinkable water to flow, and yet, how often do we stop to think about all the people and assets involved in making that everyday essential service possible? What about some of the other highly visible services delivered by councils? Waste management and recycling usually come to mind, along with upgrades to local roads, especially in urban and suburban areas. But what else? What about recreational facilities like pools, sports fields, playgrounds, parks and libraries? In some local government areas, councils even own and operate the aged care facilities, the fitness centre, the golf course and the events and function centre. Occasionally you may come across a ratepayer that says, I don't use the pool or the library or the playground. Why should I have to pay for that? And we'll get to how local government finance that later in the program. But for now, let's focus on the many and varied services we provide to our communities. From a day-to-day community livability perspective, is there another level of government that makes a bigger contribution to your daily life? Is there another level of government that is so accessible to its users and customer base? Councils usually have multiple offices, depots, facilities and service centres across their local government area. And it's not uncommon for councillors to meet people in the street or sit outside shopping centres and talk to residents. Any way you look at it, local government makes a huge contribution to life as we know it. So now let's take a look at what state government does. Here's a good selection of the larger portfolios of responsibility looked after by the Queensland State Government. Thinking in terms of daily impact, which of the services provided by the state have the greatest impact on the people of Queensland on a daily basis? Education certainly impacts people daily, as does health. Hopefully, a lot fewer people are impacted by policing on a daily basis, and yet it is the third highest profile service provided by the state, which of course ties in with our system of justice and law courts under the Attorney General. Now let's have a look at which state bodies impact directly on local government and have a look at how they impact. Now let's think about which of the state bodies impact local government specifically and have a look at how they impact our sector. Starting with the obvious one, there in purple. What does the department that has local government in its name actually do for local government? Well, for one thing, they look after the Local Government Act of 2009, which is our primary act. The department also has a rolling reform agenda that has been happening since 2018, which aims to strengthen the transparency, accountability and integrity measures that apply to local government in Queensland. These rolling reforms are the source of much of the advocacy work that your council CEO and the LGMA board and CEO do on behalf of your council and the local government sector in Queensland. We will have a closer look at the local government part of the department in a moment, but before we do, let's look at some of the other services provided by the state that impact on local government. There's the Queensland Treasury, that's where the money comes from. Transport and main roads are also a direct contributor as their network traverse the many and multiple local government areas across Queensland. There's the coordination of responses to fire and emergency, and there's also working with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority in times of natural disaster when infrastructure gets destroyed. And finally, the Queensland Ombudsman. That gives people an effective and independent way to question and investigate the administrative actions of government agencies. Depending on which council you work for, you may also have frequent contact with other departments, including Housing and Public Works, or the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. Agriculture and Fisheries could also be important if you have a lot of rural landowners in your LGA, or the Department of Environment if you have a lot of national parks. Now let's take a look into how the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning supports the sector.
We start with the Minister. Do you know who the Minister currently is? What about the Director General and the Deputy Director? The department website has this information available and is the most up-to-date reference site for the current structure. This can be found by navigating to www.qld.gov.au. So what does the local government part of the department do exactly? The answer is a fair bit. Starting with the two acts, the LGA 2009, which covers every council except Brisbane City Council, who has their own act. They are home to the Local Government Grants Commission, who provide recommendations to the Minister on the distribution of the Commonwealth Government's financial assistance grants. We will cover more on that later. They create model local laws that local governments may adopt as their own local laws. Some examples of these might be around animal control, parking, and bathing reserves. They publish a whole lot of guidelines on how local governments are required to prepare audited annual financial statements. They have a tricky thing called the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, where independent members of the tribunal deal with complaints of councillor misconduct. Note, there is a whole list with the outcomes from the hearings published for everyone to read on their website. They run the mandatory "So You Want to Be a Councillor" candidate training and publish resources for would-be councillors. This is very useful. And they provide support to another independent body, the Local Government Remuneration Commission, which established the categories for local governments and the maximum amount of remuneration payable to the councillors in each of the categories. Moving on now to the federal government. This is made up of 16 departments and government-owned entities and companies. Note that the federal government is subject to change. Federal government covers big ticket stuff like defending the country, controlling immigration, paying pensions, and looking after foreign affairs. This level of government is not so closely aligned with local government. Let's have a look at what they do. These guys collect most of the taxes through income tax and GST. Then each year they give some money to each state for local government services. But it is the state's job to divide the money up and issue it to local government. We call this money the federal assistance grants, and we will talk more about that later. The federal government also have some businesses or government-owned entities like the ABC, Australia Post, Defence Housing, and the NBN. It's time now for a few fun facts about local government that highlight what an amazing sector you have become a part of. Can you guess how many people work in local government across Australia? Not just Queensland, but across all 560 plus local governments. As at June 2021, 190,800 people in over 400 identified occupations. And yet local government employees only make up about 10% of all public servants in Australia, which, when you think about it, makes us incredibly good value. So next time someone says there are too many of us, remind them that most public servants work for the state or federal governments. How many kilometres of road do local governments maintain? Last estimate put it up around the 700,000 kilometres, which is enough road to go around the world 16.5 times. Of the 560 plus councils across Australia, how many are city councils? Yes, only about 30%. That's approximately 170 councils. Australia is a big country and most of it is not wrapped up in a city. Regional, rural and remote councils have huge areas to manage, often on more limited financial resources, and yet do such an important job. City councils have challenges too, but sometimes these are different to the ones facing our rural councils. How much does local government spend each year? Here's a hint. It's in the billions, with a B. About 36 billion actually. Local governments have massive buying power and are huge contributors to the local and state economies. And what about assets? The things we own and maintain. What are our local government assets worth? Think roads, water pipes, plant, buildings, fleet, playgrounds and parks, libraries. How much money is tied up in local government assets across Australia? The current estimate at the time of recording this presentation was 426 billion. That's a lot of money invested into building local government assets for each community. And one last final fun fact about local government. This one can result in disgruntled social media posts or unrest at Ratepayer Association meetings. Of all the taxes collected in the country by all levels of government, what percentage do you think is rates? Can you believe it? A teeny tiny 3.6% is rates. It really does make you realise we are such good value given all the things we do.
So that is the role of local government today. A manager of assets, a provider of services, a contributor to community well-being. Every day, multiple pieces of legislation touch our working lives. So it's only fitting that we spend a bit of time in that space now. You might be well aware of a piece of legislation that affects how you can do your job, or maybe it's more in the background and therefore not as visible. So, where do all these rules, regulations and laws for governing come from? Queensland state government legislation provides the legal framework within which local government operates. We start with the Constitution of Queensland 2001. All of Chapter 7 of the Constitution is about local government. It talks about the system of local government and how that system must contain a number of local governments, although it does not stipulate the actual number. Currently, Queensland has 77 local governments operating within the system. The Constitution then talks about the requirements of a local government to be elected and to carry out a good rule over a certain part of Queensland. Nearly everything else is dealt with in our very own Local Government Act of 2009, or in the case of Brisbane, the City of Brisbane Act 2010. And for all things election oriented, these are contained in the Local Government Electoral Act of 2011. For the specifics, let's look at the Local Government Act of 2009 in more detail. Our Act has a purpose and principles. The purpose of the Act is to document how a local government is to function, the nature of its responsibilities, the extent of its powers, and create a system that is accountable, effective, efficient, and sustainable. When you hear the word sustainable, what do you think it means? Some of us might immediately think of environmentally sustainable practices like recycling and responsible water usage. But sustainability in this context is actually more about the long-term financial sustainability of local government. How sustainable are our services, our infrastructure, our ability to service the community, our ability to upkeep roads or maintain water pipes? These and many more things and our ability to fund them all matter when we talk about sustainability. Now, what about the word accountable? What does that mean? Accountable to whom? I'll give you a hint. We are responsible for the management and use of public money. So yes, the public absolutely want to hold us accountable to how, where, and why that money is invested. Who else are we accountable to? The state government, of course. In effect, we are accountable to anyone who gives us money to do anything. More on this later when we talk about who monitors local government. And it is important to point out here that it is not just the local government officers who feel the burden of accountability. It really is shouldered by elected members, councillors and mayors too. Now to the two E's, effective and efficient. It's like a double act. Lots of things can be effective, but at what cost and how long will it take? So we need to be efficient. It is the sweet spot between the two that we want to hit. The visual in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen helps illustrate the balance between being effective and efficient. And this is really all about doing the right things at the right time for the right length of time and doing them right the first time. Now that we understand our purpose, let's have a look at the principles that guide what we do. So what is a principle anyway? A principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behaviour or for a chain of reasoning. So, how does this definition translate into a set of local government principles? You might have seen the principles in your local council's Code of Conduct document, or maybe you've seen them written in the strategy document. Think back to the purpose of local government and the keywords sustainable, efficient, effective, accountable. It would make sense that these words would form the basis for the principles too. So here they are. Take a moment to read them for yourself. These principles give us the foundation for our system of local government. They give us our beliefs and behaviours. They are very important when it comes to getting the job of local government done right. Look at the words. They are like the cornerstones or foundations of good government. Ethical, decision-making in the public interest, transparent, effective, inclusion, and legal. You will learn more about these principles and why they matter in your Code of Conduct training. Some concepts like legal behaviour are really easy to understand. Others like transparent can become a little grey, especially when we add in other words like effective. In short, they matter because we individually and collectively are legislatively required to deliver on this. Your codes of conduct are not something your council made up for the fun of it. It's like a promise with consequences if we fall short, real consequences, the likes of which we witnessed not that long ago across a number of local governments in southeast Queensland. We have all seen what happens when we disregard these principles. My personal favourite is meaningful community engagement. Why? Because we are local government, the closest layer of government to the people. We're the ones best positioned to understand what our communities need and want from us. It's the people that matter most to us. But wait, there's more. Yes, more legislation. How exciting! Have a guess how many Queensland Acts reference local government, meaning the Act makes some rule or statement about what local government must do, which in turn means someone in your council must be on top of that Act and know when it changes. How many do you think? 50, 100, 150? There are actually 352 Queensland Acts that reference local government in them somewhere. Here is just a small selection of some of the acts that could impact on your role within local government. You can see that there is quite a wide variety and not necessarily an obvious link or common thread between them. Essentially, the common thread is that they all drive how we deliver services in our local government area. There's legislation about dogs, waste, food, information, buildings, and the list goes on. Where you see the 3+ signs, it means that there is a whole lot more like this, along with subordinate legislation, regulations, and codes that sit underneath the actual Act. The subordinate legislation, regulations, and codes have more detail and are easier to change, so they tend to shift as the environment changes or as people's expectations change. There is a lot of information to be across from a legislative viewpoint. Luckily for us, it doesn't change too often, and there is usually lots of publicity about proposed changes to legislation, called bills, being introduced into Parliament. A proposed legislative change includes a consultation period with councils, stakeholders, and peak bodies, and when a bill is passed, it then becomes legislation. Once the legislation exists, there are commentaries written on what the Act means in practice. Think of these like a cheat sheet with notes to help local governments implement the legislation. Normally, the Department of Local Government and other bodies like LGAQ, LGMA, or private companies like King & Company lawyers will write up a guide or conduct workshops or information sessions when new legislation is enacted. Legislation is open to interpretation, so it is important to interpret it correctly. One of the reasons that interpretation is important is it usually results in actions being taken. And when we take those actions, we are using public money, which brings us to our next topic. Where does the money come from, and what are the rules for using that money? Local government is no different to any other organisation or business in that we need money to make everything happen. So, in the case of local government, where does the money come from? There are certain ways that councils can raise funds to provide infrastructure and services to communities. The primary source of income for a council is rates paid by property owners in the local government area based on land and property value. Nearly everyone who owns property pays rates, although there are some exceptions, like the state government doesn't pay rates for national parks, for example. Some councils may choose to exempt certain types of property, or sometimes they might support rates relief for some organisations, like for halls or churches owned and operated by community groups. All of that information is detailed in your council's rating policy. Other forms of income are fees and charges that apply for the supply of a product or a service. Fees apply to things like purchasing a new wheelie bin, or using the swimming pool, or hiring a hall, or lodging a building application, or registering your dog. If you don't pay a fee, sometimes you will be fined, like for an unregistered pet or failing to pay for parking. Likewise, you may pay a one-off connection fee for a service, like to connect water to a new home, and then pay an ongoing charge depending on how much water you use. This is called a volumetric charge, as it is based on the volume of water used. Fees and charges are usually worked out by some kind of equation or percentage, based on how a user would contribute to that service being provided. Sometimes a user pays the whole cost of the service. This is called cost recovery and is most common for things like building applications or permits for some sort of activity. Most of the time though, the customer or user only pays part of the cost. For example, if local government had to cover the whole cost of swimming pools or libraries from the income generated only by the people who use them, then fees would be ginormous and hardly anyone could afford to use them. When some of the cost of providing a service is paid for by everyone, regardless of use, this is done for the good of the whole community. Essentially, this refers to when council makes a decision that the benefit to the community as a whole is worth the cost of subsidising that service. Those benefits might be around health and well-being, inclusion, education, safety, or the provision of a common space like halls and sporting fields. Another form of income to councils is developer contributions and infrastructure charges. One guess where the developer contributions come from. This is a fee levied on property developers where subdivisions and newly developed blocks of land need access to services and infrastructure like roads, water, footpaths, drainage, sewerage and the like. Even if those services already exist on the land being developed, the fees are usually charged because the development will usually increase the use of existing infrastructure. The contribution from the developer might also include an allocation for new parks or public recreation spaces. It just depends on how your council decides to do this. The next form of income is grants and subsidies, which we'll come back to in a moment. Sometimes loans are used for big capital works programs. This process is just like when we get a loan from the bank, except the lender for local government is the Queensland Treasury. Loans may also be used to address intergeneration equity, which is a process that ensures the full cost of infrastructure is not borne entirely by the present-day ratepayers. For example, let's say that council needs to build a new sewage treatment plant that will service the community for 60 years. Then it makes sense for multiple generations of ratepayers to bear the cost of this via a loan. The final income source for some councils comes from council-owned businesses that operate under commercial business models. For example, your council may own and operate a caravan park, golf course, aged care facility, large sports arena, or even an airport. And maybe if your council is very good at running these businesses, they make a profit, which then gets reinvested back into those businesses as well as council services. A key thing to note here is that the ways that council raises revenue must be documented. Decisions around revenue raising always happen by way of a resolution at a council meeting. The decision and the documents must be made public, and the types of documents where this information is recorded include the corporate plan, operational plan, revenue policy, revenue statement, and of course the budget. Now let's have a closer look at grants and subsidies.
Grants and subsidies usually come from another level of government, or less frequently, they can come from another entity like a specialist environmental group or a service group. These grants or subsidies are usually in much smaller amounts in terms of overall dollars. In some cases, councils can decide themselves how they will spend the grant. At other times, the state or federal governments will determine how the money must be spent. For example, a grant to buy more books for the library can't be spent on new swings for the park. So, what kinds of grants and subsidies are there? Well, the value and purpose can change, and this is usually dependent on the political will of those giving the grants. The biggest grant by far is the federal government's Financial Assistance Grant. Let's now explore how the Financial Assistance Grant works. Here we have the Financial Assistance Grant. 64 billion since inception in the 1974-1975 financial years, up to and including the 22-23 financial year. Financial assistance grants come to local government from the federal government via the state government. There is a Local Government Financial Assistance Act 1995 that specifies that there is a general purpose part and an identified road grant. Now, the funny thing with the road grant is you don't have to spend it on roads. Both grants are untied. That means they can be spent on any council activity. The federal government passes the money over to the state government, who have set up the Local Government Grants Commission. In Queensland, in the 22-23 financial year, we got 419 million of the 2.1 billion financial assistance grant pie. The Local Government Grants Commission provides recommendations to the Minister responsible for local government in Queensland. The Commission also recommends how the financial assistance grants are distributed, including how much money goes to each council. When deciding actual dollar amounts, the Commission considers the relative need of the council, along with its own ability to raise funds. This means the allocations vary from council to council. The recommended amounts are made on the basis of assisting each council to function to an average standard for the state. Each council still has to make a reasonable effort to raise its own money. So, councils can't just slack off and think financial assistance grant will take care of it. The Commission uses a state average compiled from data provided by all Queensland councils. Each council is then compared to the state average to see how much money they get. If the council falls below the state average, they get more money per capita to get them closer to the average. If a council is above or meets the average, then that council receives the minimum grant, again based on per head of population. The financial assistance grants are distributed to councils each quarter, starting on the first working day after August 15. Now, let's have a look at some other types of grants. The current state government grants include the aptly named Local Government Grants and Subsidies Program. The 2022-23 Local Government Grants and Subsidies Program is a competitive grant program available to all Queensland local governments. The budget is around $86 million and it is delivered over 2 financial years. The primary aim of this program is to provide funding assistance to support local governments to deliver priority infrastructure and essential services that meet the identified needs of their communities. Like any grant program, your council must meet the objectives to be eligible. This means the project must show an alignment with state, regional and local priorities. The project must contribute to building safe, connected and livable communities. And it also must contribute to economic growth and employment. Grants from this fund can also be used to maintain or extend the functional life of existing and future infrastructure assets through sustainable asset management. It could also be used for projects that build resilience against future natural disasters. One of the positive features of this program is that it encourages collaboration and resource sharing between local governments. Of course, there are forms and guidelines and more forms, and councils had less than a month to get their applications in. So you absolutely had to be in it to win it. In the previous round, 92 projects from 73 councils were approved. Some examples of eligible projects include things like sewerage disposal systems, upgrades to water systems, community halls, libraries, camping grounds, heritage or natural attractions, plus foreshore developments, streetscape enhancements, rest areas and amenities, as well as resurfacing of council-owned and maintained airports. Technology was another big area of development that saw internet kiosks and public wireless access projects eligible for funding too. But let's be clear, a grant is not a gift. There are always ineligible projects and costs. These include feasibility or planning studies, conceptual designs, admin costs, overheads, or land acquisition costs. There are many other grants available from the Queensland Government. Take a minute to have a quick read through these. And there are more being announced and made available each year, which means there is plenty of money and support out there. But it's limited, it's competitive, and it comes with real expectations to deliver and a bucket load of scrutiny, and rightly so, given that it is public money. So, when you think about the sources of revenue for a council in percentage terms, where does the biggest amount come from? Let's have a look. Here we have 4 councils. The names are not important as we are simply exploring where the money comes from. These are real life numbers from actual councils. 2 coastal and 2 inland. 2 from the southeast corner and 2 from North Queensland. Have a think for a moment. In percentage terms, what do you think the split is? How much money does each council get from these different funding sources? If each vertical column should add up to 100%, what percentage of council revenue comes from rates and levies? How much from fees and charges? Remember, things like pools, hall hire, building application fees, etc. What about the federal financial assistance grants and other grants or subsidies? What percentage comes from that source? Now, what about recoverable works? Recoverable works is income from physical works that council does, like private roads and driveways. How much from there? And finally, interest from money in the bank, plus any council investments that earn interest. What percentage of council revenue comes from that? Here's a bit of an indication to get you thinking. So if the South East Queensland Coast Council gets 73% of its revenue from rates and levies, is that going to be much different for the regional or northern councils? And what about grants and subsidies? Only 25% of the revenue for the North Queensland Rural Council comes from financial assistance, grants and subsidies. Is that a surprise? Did you expect this to be a higher percentage? Now look at recoverable works and interest, only 3%, which makes sense as most councils don't tend to have truckloads of money sitting in high interest bearing accounts. Why is this? Well, because councils aim to spend what operational funds they have on service provision rather than racking up investment funds. And likewise, only 3% from recoverable works for the South East Queensland Regional Council. This is often the case as most councils are not in the business of doing work for other people. In fact, some councils don't want to compete with local contractors, so do hardly any private works. So let's take a look at the whole picture now. So, where are the similarities? The most obvious similarity is that no council is earning much of anything from interest. The South East Queensland Coastal Council must have a bit more in the bank than the others, but nothing to get too excited about. What about recoverable works? Again, relatively small numbers. However, it would seem that the North Queensland Rural Council does a bit more of these kind of works compared with others. This could be because they are remote, or it might be because there is a gap in the local market. But again, the revenue is minimal. Now to fees and charges. There is a bit of a difference here. What do you think could be influencing this? Remember, it's a user-based fee or charge. So the South East Queensland Coastal Council might have more people living there, therefore more revenue from fees. Maybe this council charges more for pool entry because their community can afford to pay more. Maybe their socio-economic demographic allows for slightly higher fees from a higher volume of users. Or maybe this council has lots of building going on and then earns more fees from building applications or resource consents. Or maybe this council has a lot of food outlets who all need food licenses. Certainly at 16% compared to a low of 3% at the North Queensland Council, something is different. Maybe the North Queensland Council charges less for application fees. The North Queensland Council might have reduced application fees to remove financial barriers to development. In reality, there are lots of reasons that could explain these differences. Now let's look at rates. One council collects 78% of its revenue from rates. At the other end, we have 61% of revenue from rates. That's a difference of 17%. What might this tell us? We can suppose any number of things. Maybe rates are higher in the South East Queensland Regional Council. Maybe property values are higher. Maybe there are more freehold properties to rate. Maybe in the North Queensland Rural and Coastal Council areas, there are big national parks that council cannot rate. Maybe there are less businesses to rate, or maybe their cents in the dollar are lower, which results in lower rates. And if we had included an Aboriginal Shire Council where there are no rating residential properties, it would be different again. Whatever the reasons, something is different, but where we see our biggest difference is in the grants and subsidies. A difference of 20% from the South East Queensland Coast, who received 5% of their revenue from grants, through to 25% in the North Queensland Rural Council. And again, even more than that for an Indigenous council. When we remember the main purpose of the financial assistance grants is to create a level playing field, we can see that some councils need more assistance to function at an average level than others. So providing a greater amount of financial assistance grants to some councils addresses this equity issue. This is a good thing, as clearly we don't want areas of major disadvantage in our state just because there are fewer people to rate or less businesses to pay fees. So you can see here that the grants and subsidies are important, even though no council outside of Indigenous councils can rely on them as their main revenue source. Now let's have one last look at where the money came from. This is one of the councils from the previous slide. The largest portion, the dark blue part, that's rates income. All the other sources together don't even make up 25% of revenue. And grants are lime green, a tiny slice of the pie at 6%. So getting your rating policy right, having easy payment methods and flexible payment arrangements is super important to local government, as most of our money comes from our own ratepayers and our own community. This is one of the reasons our community holds council accountable for what it does. Council takes their hard-earned dollars via rates, and in turn, the community wants council to use that money wisely. Councils use public money, so the public, on the whole, care about what council does with it. Some people care more, some people care less, and some don't seem to care at all. Until council does something those people think is silly or directly impacts their way of life, then we hear from them. You may have heard the term NIMBY, which stands for Not in My Backyard. This factor, more than others, is one of the key differences between local government and other businesses. Think about the cafe, the supermarket, the car dealership. These businesses all operate in the private sector. Councils operate in the public sector. It's time to have a look at what this really means and understand the difference between operating in the public sector versus the private sector.
If this is your first role working within government, chances are you've previously worked in the private sector. And the private sector is sometimes called private enterprise or business or companies. These businesses might be owned by one person, a family, or even a board of directors and shareholders in the mix. What we want to look at here are the key differences between the two sectors. Let's start with the money. When you work with public money, everything changes. It might not seem like it, but it does. The level of scrutiny goes up, and you'll find that it is the little things you need to think about, like buying stationery or shouting your team member or friend a morning tea, or buying alcohol for a function. And what about the bigger things like hiring a car or choosing a telco? Is the process for doing these things the same for the cafe owner down the street as it is for you working here at council? Of course not. And why is that? Because the money that we use at council is public money. For the cafe owner, the money they are using is their own money that their business produced for them. So if they want to buy a bottle of champagne to celebrate the week, they can open the till drawer and buy what they want. But if we were to do this at council with council's money, it would be a breach of council policy, and your actions could also come under public scrutiny if it was witnessed, or even worse, shared with the public via the news or social media. That brings us to assets. Let's say council wants to buy a car as an asset. In the cafe owner example, it is likely that there's no issues in buying a work van. There's no policy, no tender, just buy it, and when you want to sell it, you stick an ad on the web and you sell it. Not so in local government. Policies, processes, and procedures for the purchase and disposal of assets are super important. So why is that? It comes back to one of the words we spoke about in the principles and foundations that govern and guide our sector. It's got to do with being able to demonstrate transparent decision making. So what does transparent mean? It means council must be able to demonstrate a process for the purchase of that car that shows council did so impartially. That is, the purchase did not directly benefit any one person or private business more than any other. Likewise, council must be able to demonstrate that the officer did not buy a more expensive car just because the officer wanted a sunroof or metallic paint. Furthermore, councils have rules around the use of the car: who can use it, when it can be used, what has to be recorded about that use, and who pays for the use. So it's not that straightforward, and it's a slightly more complex system, you might say. Other differences include how councils engage with their customers. Yes, councils have customers, but not like in the private sector. Council customers are more captive, meaning that they don't really have a choice about where they get certain services from. For example, if you live in a local government area or own land, then you pay rates to that council and you are reliant on that council to provide you with water and collect your rubbish. The only way to access a different supplier for these services is to move to a different local government area. So council's customers have very little choice to take their business elsewhere. A resident can't just change their council the way that they might change a mobile phone provider. What this means is that council's motivation and method of charging for service delivery is different to the private sector. The private sector companies talk about profit, councils talk about community good and cost recovery. Another key difference between the two sectors is when it comes to the law. Now, we all need to abide by the law, but for local government, legislation applies much more often in our day-to-day operations than it would for your average cafe owner. And while some private sectors are more heavily regulated than others, the amount of legislation that applies to local government is certainly greater on the whole, which means greater reporting responsibilities too. And why is that? Simply, it's because more people are invested in what council does, and council provides so much to so many. So when it's all going well, most of the consumers of our services are quiet and content. I often say no complaints in local government is equivalent of a standing ovation. But if you lose water to half the town, then bam, a lot of people are impacted, and many will have opinions about what council did or didn't do, or about what council could and should do. The key takeaway here is that decision making in your small to medium sized private enterprise is pretty straightforward. There's someone at the top of the command chain that says yes or no. Within council, the complexity increases, partly because council delivers such a broad range of services and activities, but mostly because council works with public money and we report to an elected representation that sets the direction for how that money is to be used. Elected members, councillors and mayors, are elected as representatives of the community and are put there by popular vote, and they are also given one hell of a performance appraisal by way of election every 4 years. This makes for an interesting tension between the governance or councillor side of things and the operational side. And really, there aren't many other sectors or businesses where you see this division of setting strategic direction by way of public meetings and then the operational delivery of those strategic objectives in many other places. Here is an example of how this all plays out in real life to demonstrate the contrast between decision making for small business and decision making in a council. What you want to understand is that the level of complexity ramps up mostly due to where our money comes from and who we are accountable to. Continuing with our cafe and catering business owner as a private sector example, the first decision of the day is deciding on a bank. The cafe manager chooses Bank X because they've always done business with that bank, or the bank is handy, or even they've got the best business banking package. When council chooses a bank, it's through an expression of interest process, usually followed by a tender, but it doesn't end there. Then a report is written and usually presented to the executive leadership team, the ELT, who then make a recommendation to the CEO. Then sometimes a report would go to a council meeting for a decision, and from there a service agreement or even a contract is drawn up that locks the council into that bank for a certain number of years. All of this can easily take up to 4 months in the process just to get a new bank sorted. Next decision, buying a car. The cafe owner decides on the type of car they want. They might do some research or maybe go to a dealer they know, and they buy the car and then get some cool advertising and decals stuck on the side. Council is different. Your procurement manager or fleet manager might meet with the manager who wants the car and the person who has the authority over the budget expenditure. Both officers must refer to and understand the procurement policy and the fleet policy, making sure the steps taken do not conflict with any of these policies. Vehicle requirements are determined, documented, and usually argued over a bit before consensus is reached. A tender is done up, usually submitted online, sometimes advertised in the local paper or on council's website, and then council waits for the tender to close, usually around 28 days, sometimes less, sometimes more. Tenders are assessed, a report is written with a recommendation, then the budget holder, assuming they have the delegated authority to do so, decides on which car is purchased. Sometimes the decision goes up to the CEO for sign-off, especially when buying local is part of the assessment criteria. Then, once council takes delivery of the car, there may be a need to fit two-way radios or include a first aid kit or e-road devices for tolls or tracking and other job-specific requirements. Finally, council get to brand the vehicle and the officer gets to use it. Moving on to pricing. How does the private sector price goods and services compared to a council? The private sector more often will have a simpler equation. Take fixed costs, add variable costs, add a profit margin, and that's the sales price. Council have For council, they first have to decide on the methodology. Is the user paying 100% of the cost of that service? Can council even determine who the user is in order to determine whether to charge a fee? Thinking about playgrounds in this scenario, there are no fees as there's usually no real way to determine who the users are. What about a pool? It is much easier to define users. They are the wet people in the pool, right? But if pool users had to pay the full cost of a swim, no one would go. So a decision around what is the community good for pools needs to be made. Community good means that council thinks the community is better off with affordable pool entry compared with no access to a pool at all. This means some of the costs of running the pool will come out of general rates and the actual users of the pool will pay just a little bit. Now, to get that individual user charge put in place for the pool, it has to go up to the council meeting along with all other fees and charges to be considered. There's also usually a budget meeting, and then councillors must adopt the fee before council can charge the pool users. So this is quite clearly a more complex process that takes into consideration more and different factors than deciding on what price to sell coffee at in your cafe. Now let's look at the working week. The cafe owner may, after a bit of trial and error, decide to work the hours that are most profitable. Council officers work the hours that are needed, within reason, of course. No one would expect libraries to be open 24/7, for example. Well, they might, but it would be deemed unaffordable, so a council could not, in good conscience, do that. Instead, Councils have standard hours for most jobs and some on-call hours for those jobs that, yes, sometimes do need to be available 7 days a week. If council wants to charge operating hours, there would be unions to talk with, affected employees to meet with, a community who may need to be consulted, and it goes on. So again, it's quite a process. Let's look at dealing with difficult people now. In the cafe, if someone doesn't like their meal, the cafe manager has a chat, says sorry, replaces the meal, or refunds the money. Case closed. In council, we get a grumpy resident at the front counter. We do our best to assist them with their inquiry. We might need to get our manager, who may solve the issue or not, as some things are not always able to be solved. If the issue is unresolved, it is escalated, and in some cases, the CEO may now be involved. The CEO supports the officer's position as they have acted in accordance with council policies and procedures and therefore have acted in the interests of the common good. The disgruntled resident is now even more grumpy, and they decide to write a letter to the mayor and get onto a virtual soapbox on social media and tell everyone how unhappy they are about how council has handled their complaint. And if the grumpy resident really wants to make their sentiments known, they may even choose to write to the Queensland Ombudsman, which we will cover in much more detail later. Moving on to scope now. The scope of the work involved in the public versus private sector differs significantly. Whether your council is large or small, councils all over Queensland deliver a whole range of functions and services. Show me another organisation out there that manages pools and playgrounds, buys baby books and bitumen, that deals with rubbish and recycling whilst also planning events and curating an art exhibition. No one organisation does as much as councils do, right? Our scope is massive, and our customers don't come from the one demographic either. We serve grandparents, farmers, miners, school kids, families, and everyone in between. Our target audience is the whole community. Our customer is everyone, not just residents, business owners, and tourists passing through. We hope you can see from this comparison that our role, scope, and our way of delivering services is very different to your average mid-sized private sector business. And that's because the decisions that councils make affect so many people. Let's now take a look at exactly how the plethora of decisions are made by you, the council officers, every day within local government areas across Queensland. Firstly, who makes the decisions in local government? In your family, it might be you and or your significant other that makes most of the decisions. Say you were deciding what to have for dinner. Sometimes the kids might get to weigh in on the decision, but ultimately you as the parent get the final say based on the nutritional value or convenience of their desired choice. The point here is that even when making seemingly simple decisions, like what to have for dinner, it can involve a range of decision makers who have varying levels of authority when it comes to having the final say. The same applies to councils. There are many decision makers who make different kinds of decisions. Many officers make lots of decisions every day. Some decisions are made by the executive managers, others can be made only by the CEO, and some decisions can only be made by councillors during the scheduled public council meetings. Sometimes councils are told by the state what the decision is, and they have no option but to implement that decision. And on other occasions, there is a combination of people involved in a decision, like when officers put forward a recommendation to management, management then makes a decision on what to recommend to the council, and then the councillors vote on that recommendation. Once that happens, a decision is made and it goes back down the chain of command to the officers to implement the decision. So, how do you decide what type of decisions you can make and can't make as a council officer? And if you can't make a decision, then who can? It's a bit confusing, especially when you are new. So, if in doubt, always ask your manager. Let's take a look at a decision-making example related to the running of a water treatment plant. Is there any point asking councillors about bacteria levels and what personal protective equipment should be worn? Let's have a closer look. First, let's look at the use of fluoride in the water. This can be a potentially controversial topic on occasions, but for today, let's just go with it as an example where the community and councillors have agreed that it's a good idea. In this example, the water treatment plant operators will decide how much fluoride goes in the water. Their decision will be based on science and health recommendations and standard operating procedures. These officers will decide on the right procedure for adding fluoride to the water. Officers will also determine the right way to handle the fluoride and make decisions on things like PPE, whether they're required to handle the chemicals, and how to store the chemicals safely. Now let's have a think about how the fluoride is purchased. Management would determine a council-wide procurement policy. This policy would then decide how the fluoride is purchased, but before any of that happens, councillors, back around 2012, would have decided if the fluoride was even to be added to the water. So you can see there is a hierarchy of decision making. There are operational decisions, management decisions, and then decisions made by councillors. Now let's look at the bacteria levels in the water. The water treatment plant operators would monitor bacteria levels and decide, again based on science and health recommendations, what is a safe level. Management would consider what risk was acceptable when it came to bacteria in the water, and management would also have some position and processes on how unsafe drinking water messages are communicated to the community. Management would also decide on a plan on how to best manage the life cycle of the water treatment plant, including how long it will last and what it will cost to maintain and replace. Councillors will be involved in decisions about improvements to the water service, as well as the levels of service that focus on how far above the minimum or mandatory standards council would want the water to be at and at what cost and how that would be funded. One last example is personal protective equipment, or PPE. Providing the right PPE for working at the water treatment plant would be an operational decision, so made by the officers involved and ticked off by the workplace health and safety officer, whereas the overall workplace health and safety policy would be determined by management, and councillors would have to decide to allocate the budget required to supply the PPE to the officers, and would also need oversight to execute their duty of care to ensure workers were provided with a safe working environment. So you can see there are different people making different decisions at different levels within and external to council at different stages of the decision-making process. So let's talk a bit more about operational decisions. Operational decisions are the day-to-day common sense decisions that every officer makes while doing their job. Operational decisions could be based on instructions, standard operating procedures, a manual, established practice, a procedure, or even a policy. Some of these decisions are based on delegated responsibility. This means your job description would say you can make these decisions. For example, as someone who organises council meetings, your job description says you are to order the lunches for council meetings, and you then decide, with the budget provided and following any relevant policies, how to do this. Another example is servicing fleet cars. It will be somebody's job to manage the fleet and decide where cars go to get serviced and how that will happen. There might be a policy on this, or there may not be. There might be accepted processes, or a procurement policy might speak to using local services as a first choice. Whatever it is, the officer responsible will make the decisions according to the policies and procedures and organise the services. Another example is behaviour in the library. Officers who work in the library will have been trained in what is acceptable customer behaviour for the library. The standard might be part common sense and part written policy or procedure on how to deal with difficult people. But the decision on how to respond when a bunch of kids are being rowdy will largely be in the hands of the library officer to make that decision in the moment. These are all examples of operational decisions. Next, we have management policy decisions. Policy decisions are made when it helps to have one shared understanding of something. In this instance, the management team will choose to write down the collective decision on why and how certain things are to be done and call it a policy or procedure. This helps with people being treated fairly. Policies also help officers to understand expectations and keep everyone on the same page. This means individual officers can refer to the policy and follow the guidelines or rules given. An example might be a recruitment policy. This policy might talk about recruitment on merit. It might have a procedure for advertising vacancies. The policy might document things like moving allowances and address other things associated with recruitment, like how many people on the selection panel, to ensure that there is a fair process in place. Management policies can be made by management and do not require a decision from councillors to come into effect. Officers should be able to assess these policies and read them as needed. You might find them on your intranet. Some council policies will be referenced during another part of this induction process. Policies are not secret or hidden. To work effectively, officers need to know they exist. Ideally, policies become the playbook for how your council works as an organisation. If in doubt about a management policy, go ask your manager for guidance. A word of caution though about blaming a policy or saying something is policy when it's not. If you believe there is something wrong with a policy, then be the person who takes action to make it better. Chances are you are not the only one having an issue. And when talking with customers, be careful that you don't inadvertently misinterpret or invent fictional policies. It is your responsibility as a council officer to provide clear and accurate information to the public. At some point, some clued up customer will ask to see the policy, and if the information doesn't match or council doesn't actually have a policy in place, well, that's going to cause a much bigger problem for you and for council. The next level of decision making sits with councillors. This is a significant level, as this is what you might call public policy making. The decisions around adopting council policy happens at a council meeting, and these meetings are open to the public. Reports from officers go to these meetings with recommendations. Councillors then discuss the report and vote in favour or against the presented policy. There are some very important policy decisions made by councillors, which include things like the rating policy, the delegations policy, media policy, and meeting procedures policy. These policies are all crucial aspects of having council function like it should and deliver on the commitment of good governance for the region. There are a whole raft of policies adopted around the budget each year, including rates setting, rates arrears, rates discounts, and the like. Without these policies, council would not be able to collect rates from the community. It is important to note that council policy stays in effect until it is replaced by a new policy or it is rescinded. Rescinded means council has made a decision to remove that policy. These policies are not negotiable and when done well provide very little wiggle room or grey area. These policies help officers do the job the way councillors and the community want it done. Interpretation is everything, so it is important that all policies are well written and able to be understood and implemented. So what triggers the need to take something to councillors for a decision? An easy example to start with would be that there is no current adopted budget for an activity or service. In this case, a report for decision would need to go to the councillors. Another example may be the first time that council has done something. Often this will go to council for a decision. Commonly, if there are high levels of community interest in a matter, then that will go to councillors for a decision too. Likewise, when it is a one-off special project, like a big capital works project, then off to the councillors it goes. Sometimes the Local Government Act says only councillors can decide on something, so off it goes to the councillors. Another example is the appointment of the CEO. This can't be delegated. The councillors have to decide on that appointment. And clearly, if a decision has not been delegated to the CEO, then neither the CEO nor any other officer can make the decision. In these instances, when no delegation exists, then only councillors can make the decision. Usually decisions of a legally binding nature that have big dollars involved or high risk go to councillors. An example would be awarding tenders over a certain amount. Another example is selling up properties for rates owing. Many planning and land use decisions are made by councillors, especially when the development does not meet the requirements of the district plan. And of course, the district plan is a decision for councillors. You can see why council has regular public meetings. So councillors can come together, make decisions, and then we as officers can get on with the job of implementing and delivering. Sometimes simpler but high profile decisions go to councillors, things like donations and sporting group funding. Sometimes councils have programs that provide grants to certain groups. These decisions would nearly always be made by councillors, even when the money isn't huge, as councillors often want to be involved in these community-based good news story decisions. Before we move on from decision making, let's have a look at a couple of example decisions and the pathways they might take. Decision number 1, purchasing playground equipment. The starting point for the decision may be budget. If there is an established budget for the playground equipment and the officer involved has delegated authority to use that budget, then it's off to procurement we go. On the other hand, if there is no money allocated, then that would trigger a report to council and a decision from councillors to approve the allocation of funds for this purpose, or not. So in this example, having the money already allocated by the council and having the delegated authority to spend it is very important. When those two things exist, budget and delegated authority to spend, then the officer is going to make the purchasing decision following the procurement policy and any other playground renewal plans that might exist. Now let's look at a media inquiry. Something happens and the reporter walks into the front counter of the council customer service centre and starts to ask the customer service officer what is going on. This should be a massive red flag for the customer service officer at the counter because it's not in their job description to answer questions from the media. So if they didn't already know what to do from having a great induction process, they would refer the reporter to their manager. The manager would know that there is a policy on media and that policy would say what to do. So they would follow the policy, which would most likely say to refer the reporter to the council communications officer, and from there the communications officer would manage the matter by referring to the policy. Depending on the matter, the policy may also stipulate that only the CEO or the mayor can talk to the media, and therefore that is what would happen. The key here is to stick with the policy as it protects you as much as it protects council. Okay, last example, introducing a new service for council. Let's say there is a desire for a new library. Can an officer go and decide to build a new library? Obviously not. This would involve a lot of money, so it's a big decision with significant risk attached. Most likely, even before a report went to councillors, there might be a call made to workshop the concept with the councillors. This is okay as long as no decisions are made at the workshop and it is only used to set the direction or figure out the potential scope of the project. The workshop could also result in a report being put to council, but this is not a decision, merely an initial information gathering and fact-finding process. Decisions by councillors can only be made in a properly notified council meeting. So the report is written, lots of options are presented, and then the report goes to a council meeting so that councillors can vote on an option. Options can be anything from don't do it to invest moderately to invest on a large scale. Options can also vary from doing nothing right through to doing something of differing proportions. The recommendation is the option that the report recommends to councillors, but councillors don't have to go with that recommendation. Eventually, the process will get to the point where the councillors will vote and decide what the new library project will look like, and from there it is highly likely that the concept will then go out for public consultation. The need for public consultation is usually determined by another policy, usually called the community consultation policy or similar. Then, after public consultation happens, a second report to council, including feedback from the community consultation, would be written. This second report may then allow councillors to make a decision on the project. This could be a rather long time frame for decision making, especially for expensive projects or projects with far-reaching consequences. That's okay. As officers, we need to do a thorough job when writing reports for councillors to base their decisions on. So as you can see, all this decision making explains, in part anyway, why local government is so heavily monitored. Let's now move on to who monitors local government and why. Local government is heavily monitored by lots of different people, agencies and entities. The monitoring happens in part because we use public money and because we affect the lives of so many. If we get our water services wrong, we can make people sick or even cause their death. If we don't handle information correctly, we could cause massive grief over privacy issues. In part, these are just some of the reasons local government is so closely monitored. Another two reasons why local government is heavily monitored is because we use democracy as our decision-making tool and transparency as a way to share the reasons behind our decisions. Sometimes as a council, we don't even know we are being monitored until we read about it online. But mostly we are monitored because we must demonstrate good governance and wise use of public money. So firstly, anyone who gives local government money will want your council to fill out forms and report on what was done with that money. One thing about local government, there are lots of forms and lots of reporting. Furthermore, anyone who is the owner of an act that local government works under will want to know what council does, especially if that act has given local government powers to do things. Councils are forever working towards completing a reporting mechanism for something. It might be grants or end of financial year reporting or specific activity reporting, or it could be a request for more statistics on XYZ activity. We call this the reporting cycle, and it can seem relentless, like a treadmill or a bicycle that you can never get off. But reporting is a fact of life in local government. So if we can learn to embrace it, you'll have much more fun, especially when you know that the reporting is as much a part of delivering services to the community as a playground or mowing the grass. Now, individual people monitor local government too. Here we are talking about people like residents and ratepayers, especially those individuals who think we may be getting something wrong. Or maybe a person has had a bad experience with council. We mentioned the Queensland Ombudsman before. Any resident can go to the Queensland Ombudsman and make a complaint about any local government matter. The Queensland Ombudsman will look at everything except issues with councillors or privacy breaches. Those two things have their own special places to go. In fairness, the upset person cannot go straight to the Ombudsman. They have to have gone to the council first to raise their concerns. Then, once they have exhausted all options with the council, right up to the CEO, if they still don't feel like they have an answer, then it's off to the Ombudsman they go. From there, the process unfolds. The Ombudsman investigates and documents a recommendation or some kind of outcome to bring about a conclusion. This can take a while. If it's a privacy matter, then the individual goes to the Office of the Information Commissioner. This also starts a process and takes some time for a conclusion to be reached. Both the Ombudsman and Privacy Commissioner issues are usually managed by senior managers. Sometimes the CEO will manage the matter personally. When a complaint is about a councillor, then it is investigated by the Office of the Independent Assessor. Should the complaint be substantiated, it is referred to the Councillor Code of Conduct Tribunal. If you are super keen, you can read all the findings of the Councillor Code of Conduct Tribunal on the Department of Local Government website. It's a bit of a horror show of bad behaviour and clearly not demonstrating the best of local government's intent as far as councillors go. In terms of you as an officer, you also no doubt care about how you are treated, and the usual avenues for employee-related disputes are available to all local government employees, as they are for any other employees. If a council is a bad employer, then the individual employee can head off to the Fair Work Ombudsman, their union, WorkSafe, or even their lawyer, should they wish to. Likewise, if someone suspects council of doing something illegal, like fraud or theft, they can go to the police, the Crime and Misconduct Commission, or if it's about discrimination, then they can refer the issue to the Human Rights Commission. So that's a summary of the formal ways in which we are monitored and scrutinised across local government. But there is another layer of scrutiny that is always at play for people working in local government. Have you ever heard someone at your council use the phrase, "Would that pass the courier mail test?" Or perhaps the other iteration, "Would that pass the pub test?" What we mean by both these statements is if you were to tell a journalist or your mates at the pub about what council was doing, would they be happy about it or unhappy about it? Would it make front page news or be the topic of gossip and rumour for all the wrong reasons? Councils can often be seen as a good source of bad news. More often than not, council is also the biggest employer and the biggest advertiser in town, so the local paper will be more than happy to offer council a lot of column space to fill the pages. And chances are that the content written about council won't all be fair and balanced reporting. So why does the media love to hate council? Because councils do a lot of stuff and councils affect daily life, and because councils have politicians who say stuff that is sometimes newsworthy in a good way and sometimes not so much. And now we also have new media in the mix, where everyone with a computer, a keyboard, and an internet connection can call themselves a journalist and influence public opinion about things you may be doing at council, either for good or for evil. These people include bloggers, social media influencers, with a couple of 100,000 followers on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Facts are often optional as opinions rule the online world. Anyone can be an expert, and most people don't let the truth get in the way of a grand story. So what do we do as council officers when a keyboard warrior or internet troll decides to use their influence for evil and slander the good name of your council across the internet? Your first and best line of defense is avoid doing anything dumb. Don't say dumb stuff, and certainly don't put anything out in the public arena yourself. Refrain from commenting on social media or other platforms, as the truth often does not matter to these people. Follow your council's media policy, or better yet, don't read rubbish sites in the first place. Unless you are in marketing or communications at council, keep out of local government hate sites. These sites will only make you sad and angry, or both. Now, to round out this section on monitoring, let's have a look at the local government principles as a guide for our behaviour. As we just heard, there are a lot of interested people keeping a keen eye on what is happening in local government to make sure we are upholding the principles of transparency and accountability. Remember, we discussed them right back at the start. Here's a reminder of the local government principles that underpin everything we do. To help keep us all on the straight and narrow, and to understand the expectations placed on local government employees, your council will have developed a whole bag of policies. Now, some policies will focus on the people and what happens across the various service areas within council, and some are internal policies specifically designed to inform you about expected behaviours. One of the most important policies you need to know and understand is the Code of Conduct. And if you haven't yet completed your Code of Conduct training, make sure you get it done as soon as possible. This is the most important policy because it exists to protect you and your rights as an employee, as well as to protect council. And there are a number of other policies that you will want to make sure you are familiar with in order to make sure you are able to fulfill your job as a local government officer. This is only a sample, and your council might have slightly different names for them. And the key takeaway here is that you need to read and understand the policies so that you are in no doubt about what is acceptable and what is not in terms of your conduct and behaviour as a local government officer. Most policies are built around common sense combined with aspects of our legislative duties and compliance. So make sure you give yourself time to learn about the policies that matter to your job. Read them and understand the practical application of them. It's really important. Make it your business to understand your council's employee policies. Doing so will keep you safe, keep you employed, and keep your reputation intact. If in doubt about a policy, ask your manager. Ask twice if you need to. Better to be certain than act without fully understanding the ramifications. Good managers will be happy you have asked, and you will ensure you are doing your bit to enhance the reputation of local government. Good news, we're nearly done. Just one more area to look at, and that is who inhabits the local government pond. In addition to Local Government Managers Australia, there are some fine and useful organisations out there in the local government pond. Here is a list of a few that could be useful for you to be aware of. Depending on what you do, you might choose to join one of these profession-based groups like the Local Government Finance Professionals Association, or the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia, or the Planning Institute of Australia. There are several unions who have local government employees as members, and you should have a nominated union representative in your workplace where you can access more information on unions, or you can become a member of LGMA. Membership with LGMA is a must-have for anyone looking to develop their career in local government. Your membership gives you access to ongoing professional development and networking opportunities with council officers just like you from every council across Queensland. We also provide advocacy services to the local government sector and keep our members informed of relevant trends and changes which may impact on their work. Through LGMA, you can participate in online networking exchanges, webinars, and face-to-face training with people working in similar roles to you from councils across Queensland. We also host a wide range of specialty events like the Inspire and Women in Local Government conferences, as well as the annual Queensland Local Government Conference. LGMA also offers a range of in-house training and professional development courses specifically tailored to the needs of local government officers and the local government sector. Head to our website for more information.
You probably have a superannuation account or two from other jobs. Here is the local government offering, Brighter Super. These guys have been around for a long time, are trusted, and have proven their performance time and time again. Ask your manager or HR about the forms you need to fill in to become a member. You can transfer your current super over, and Brighter Super can also provide superannuation services for your partner too, if you like.
The last group we want to mention is the Local Government Association of Queensland, or LGAQ for short. LGAQ has been around in one form or another for a very long time. You may have been recruited via their recruitment team, or you may have visited their website to better understand some aspects of local government. LGAQ is a primary source of information and guidance for many mayors and councillors. LGAQ also works with councils to focus on issues that matter to our sector. Their work includes advocacy to state and federal government from an elected representative point of view. So let's end on a high by reminding ourselves about all the things we love about working in local government. Sometimes we can be a bit shy about standing up and being counted as a local government employee. We shouldn't be. Local government provides great services. We manage heaps of community assets, and we consistently deliver for people who live in our area. Local government is an amazing sector, full of wonderful, dedicated, caring people. Be proud to be a local government employee. We build stuff, we maintain stuff, we deliver stuff, and we care about what we do. We make a difference, and we do it all on a relatively small amount of money. Life would be very different and very difficult without us. Take a moment to reflect on that statement. And remember, you are playing a vital role in a much bigger picture, helping to make our communities safe, livable, and desirable places to be. In closing, we love local government and we are excited to be working with you. We trust that you have enjoyed this presentation, and if you have any questions, please get in contact with us. If you're thinking about becoming a member, go to our website and find out where you can take part in the next networking event, training, and professional development activities. Local Government Managers Australia is here to be of service to you and the sector as a whole. Thank you for your attention and all the very best on the next phase of your exciting journey in local government.